All right, we're back. You know, the idea of gun bans has been around for a very long time. And in this case, you know, the gun banners have wasted no time in calling for a new federal ban based on the tragedy that occurred in California. Now, 3 of those individuals that died there were stabbed to death, and they were stabbed before the kid ever even grabbed his weapon and started to go outside and get in his car. There were 3 additional innocent people who were shot to death, and in addition to that, there were a number that were injured. Now, quite a few of them were injured not by a gun, not by a knife, but by him driving his car into them. I mean, the kid ran over. There was one fellow that he drove into and broke both his legs, and he didn't fire at him. He just hit him with his car. Now, immediately, Richard Blumenthal, the Democrat from Connecticut, jumped right out there on CBS Face the Nation, and the first thing he said was that we need to relook at this issue. He said, I really sincerely hope that this tragedy, this unimaginable, unspeakable tragedy, will provide an impetus to bring back measures that would keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people who are severely troubled or deranged, like this young man was. All right, stop right there. First and foremost, the kid went through the background checks. Secondarily, he bought the guns legally. Thirdly, he was even interviewed by the sheriff's department, 2 days before he went off on this rampage. And he had an extensive history of mental illness and of clinical help that had been provided for him since the kid was 8. He was only 22. I mean, he'd spent more of his life in therapy than out of therapy. He goes on to say that, Blumenthal, that we need mental health resources, and that initiative, I hope, will provide common ground, a point of consensus that will bring us together in the Congress and enable the majority. 90% of the American people want background checks to be heard. All right, stop right there. The truth of the matter is that's an absolute bald-faced lie, and I'm getting tired of hearing it. 90% of Americans cannot agree on what they had for breakfast, not even what they're going to have tomorrow morning. They can't even agree on what they actually had today. This nonsense and this argument about constantly throwing out these examples of how 90% this, 97% of that, you know, it's the same crap we hear about on global warming. 90% of scientists agree. That's a lie. 90% of scientists can't agree on how to spell scientist. It's all lies. You see, well, all right. The point is simply this. This is not a function and a concern or a question about whether or not this kid should have been barred from owning a gun. Nobody agrees that he should have had access to one. Clearly, the kid had mental disease. He had a mental problem. The problem is not the fact that he had the mental problem or the guns. The problem is that when the two come together. And to be honest with you, the fact that the cues were missed is not a reason to turn around and say, but we're going to then strip everyone else of their ability and their right to be able to own and possess a firearm. The host of this program looked at Blumenthal and he said, the sheriff, quote, this is the host of the program now, the sheriff told us that there were no flags that would have prompted a check on the legally purchased weapons that Elliot Rodger had. And he didn't seem to have large or larger than normal size magazines for his weapons. Do you believe legislation in the Senate, or legislation that the Senate did not pass, would have made any difference in this case. Now, before we tell you what Blumenthal's answer was, let's recognize that because he lived in California, he's already limited to 10 rounds per magazine. And so that ought to tell you right off the bat that this argument that you can ban the total number of rounds in a magazine is of any value whatsoever. Because apparently this kid had plenty of extra magazines and he was feeding multiple pistols. Blumenthal answered the legislation had failed and that legislation would have given more resources to law enforcement to have a greater screening for this kind of derangement. Well, that's a lie, too. What he said is the legislation that failed to pass support from 55 senators would have provided a mental health initiative with more resources, greater ability for the Santa Barbara police to intervene, to use the sheriff's word, to have professionals trained in diagnosing and detecting this kind of derangement. Obviously, not every kind of gun violence is going to be prevented by laws out of Washington, but at least we can make a start, and I'm going to urge that we bring back those bills, maybe reconfigure them to center on mental health, which is a point where we can agree. You see, here's the problem with that entire statement. One, it makes a presumption that the mental health initiative aspect of the bill, which was an afterthought and a footnote, would actually have some bearing on this particular case, or that it would have a bearing on any other case. Two, it makes the other dangerous presumption that, one, we can take the sheriff's word, or that we should want to trust or take the sheriff's word when we see how the police departments in the nation right now are operating, outside of the boundaries of their own law and duty, unwilling to follow the oath they've taken. Third, it makes the presumption that professionals trained in diagnosing and detecting this kind of derangement are actually interested in anything other than an agenda. See, the truth is, that's why they use such vague and incomprehensible language, because all of that sounds kind of nice and rosy on the surface. But that's the same kind of legislative rhetoric that we got in order to get past and get through Obamacare. But now when we see the actual implementation of it, and we understand that Congress never passes anything that has any actual meat to it. All they do is pass the framework. All they do is pass the box. But then somebody fills the box with rules and regulations. And ladies and gentlemen, therein lies the problem. You see, the problem here is that the gun banners are the writers of the rules and regulations to fill the box. Don't forget that most of them come out of Washington. And if they don't come out of Washington on a federal level, they come out on a state level in your state houses. And a good many of these state houses are in ultra-uber-liberal zones where they would just as soon see guns banned. I remind you of the statement from the legislators in New Jersey who said, our goal is confiscate, confiscate, confiscate. Where does that dovetail? Where does that comport with the Constitution in any way, shape, or form? I mean, it's in complete and total diametric opposition to the Constitution in a host of areas, not the least of which is it's the unlawful taking of property. Forget what the property is. You see, the real reason that we have people who are trying to get gun bans, and this goes to the point that I mentioned before about Dr. Carson in the previous segment, is because there is always a list of statists and totalitarians out there who will take the rules that are created and the alleged common sense passage of a piece of legislation to subvert, twist, and misinterpret the intentional goal of that legislation. And then, of course, it's up to us to take it to court and try to win back the right we've given up. And, of course, we're going to court in local areas or in areas where we have absolutely no capability to win because you've got activist judges who are making these determinations, and or you're going there to a Supreme Court, which our founders told us very clearly is not the final arbiter of the law. We know beyond a reasonable and beyond a shadow of a doubt that the intention of the liberal progressive movement is to completely remove from the potential of ownership all guns. Samuel Adams told us that the Constitution shall never be construed to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms. And he didn't preface or suffix that with a statement that says, unless there is a significant percentage of the population that's mentally deranged. Richard Henry Lee said to us, to preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of people always possess arms and be taught alike, especially when young, how to use them. Now, with all due respect, if you take a look at this situation that happened out in California, this kid, and I read an article the other day about how he was talking about in his manifesto when he went to a range and he was training himself to do this. He bought a gun. He'd never held a gun before or never had access to one before. And his first gun, he went and he took it to a range so that he could practice. The truth is, had the kid possibly been taught a healthy respect for firearms, he wouldn't have felt so empowered when he suddenly got drunk with the power of one. The people are not to be disarmed of their weapons. They are left in full possession of them. Zachariah Johnson. You see, we know beyond a reasonable doubt that the intention was for us to have unlimited ownership of firearms. How do I know that? I'm going to prove it to you right now. Patrick Henry made a very clear, it's crystal clear after you hear what he had to say. Are we at last brought to such humiliating and debasing degradation that we cannot be trusted with arms for our defense? Where is the difference between having our arms in possession and under our direction and having them under the management of Congress? If our defense be the real object of having those arms, in whose hands can they be trusted with more propriety or equal safety to us, as in our own hands? He made it very clear. If you give Congress the ability to limit your ability to own a firearm, then you have lost it. And the management of Congress is completely unacceptable. Samuel Adams, that the said Constitution shall never be construed to authorize Congress to infringe the just liberty of the press or the rights of conscience, or to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms. You see, they knew we would come to a day like today. They understood that there was a certain element in the nation that would seek to disarm the American people so that they could be enslaved by their own government. They knew it. They spoke extensively about it. And the fact is, gun bans are always lurking around the corner because there are always going to be individuals who will put their statist agenda, and even misguided. Look, a lot of the people that are out there right now that believe the way they believe, I'm sure they actually sincerely believe that. I'm sure that they believe that guns are really the problem. Now, it's a matter of ignorance, the fact that they have refused steadfastly to look at the real evidence behind the problem. Because I got to tell you, before the late 60s, when the Gun Control Act went into play and became law, we didn't have gun shootings like this all over the place, and we had just as many on a pro rata basis of weaponry out there as we have today. We didn't have kids going into schools and shooting each other. Of course, we didn't have kids on antidepressants and ADHD medicine and speed, legal methamphetamine either, did we? We didn't have a society that taught you that there is no consequence and that you are not responsible for your own actions because it's someone else's fault. Guard with jealous attention the public liberty. Suspect everyone who approaches that jewel. Unfortunately, nothing will preserve it but downright force. Wherever you give up that force, you are inevitably ruined. Patrick Henry. See, they knew. Firearms stand next in importance to the Constitution itself. They are the American people's liberty teeth and keystone under independence. From the hour the Pilgrims landed to the present day, events, occurrences, and tendencies prove that to ensure peace, security, and happiness, the rifle and pistol are equally indispensable. The very atmosphere of firearms everywhere restrains evil interference. They deserve a place of honor with all that is good. George Washington. We cannot pretend. We cannot allow anyone to approach that jewel. Because, and I did a show about this going back, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago. The statistic numbers of 262 million dead human beings, all at the hands of governments, far outweigh the number of people that are killed in the United States, or any other country for that matter, as a result of someone with a rogue mental illness. Because you see, the mental illness that the person who is rogue and goes out there and commits a school shooting or an atrocity like this kid in Isla Vista, that's the same mental illness that the statist has. It's the same pathological mental disease that the tyrant has. Complete and total lack of empathy. Pathological. The only difference is they've got power. What? You thought that the people that ran and that run Somalia and the people who are running Syria, you think the people who are currently running nations in distress under dictatorships, you think those nations are being run by level-headed, well-adjusted, psychologically stable individuals? Do you think Russia is being run under a completely psychiatrically stable Putin? Do you think the United States of America is being run by completely logical, rational, well-reasoned, well-adjusted, mentally stable Congress, White House, courts? Absolutely not. Do you think China is run? You see, here's the point, folks. Totalitarianism is a function of mental illness. Now, they can gather a flock of supporters underneath them who are, for all intents and purposes, those people are pawns to be used in a game. But it doesn't detract from the fact that they themselves have a mental illness that is associated with their continuing expansion of power. It's an addiction. And by the definition of our own enlightened medical community and psychiatric community, addiction is a mental disease and illness. So it's a mental disease and illness unless it involves power? Is that the argument you want to put forth? Because I don't think you're going to carry that one very far. By the time you get to the end of that argument, you will realize your bucket is empty of water. Those who have the command of the arms in a country are masters of the state and have in their power to make what revolution they please. Thus, there is no end to observations on the difference between the measures likely to be pursued by a minister backed by a standing army and those of a court awed by the fear of an armed people. That's an argument that was quoted by John Trenchard. There's an argument showing from Aristotle, actually, that a standing army is inconsistent with a free government and absolutely destructive to the Constitution. James Berg, in Political Disquisitions, an enquiry into public era's defects and abuses in London, he wrote this: "No kingdom can be secured otherwise than by arming the people. The possession of arms is the distinction between a freeman and a slave. He who has nothing and who himself belongs to another must be defended by him whose property he is, and needs no arms. But he who thinks he is his own master and has what he can call his own ought to have arms to defend himself and what he possesses. Else he lives precariously and at discretion, at the discretion of his slave master." The real challenge that we have, America, is that we have forgotten why we cannot allow a gun ban in the first place. Not the fact that gun bans always lurk around the corner, merely the fact that they lurk around the corner because the people who are promoting a gun ban, the people who are promoting your limitation, it doesn't have to be a ban. It just has to be an infringement of your ability. And the reason that they want to limit that is because the designs that they have for you necessarily require you to be unarmed. And the same mental disease that afflicted that young man in Isla Vista is the same mental disease that infects every head of every state. Some just more violent than others, but all of them are infected with the same disease. The disease of ruthless self-promotion. And the disease that they actually don't have. How do I best state this? That their interests trump yours. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to come back and talk about, according to the DHS, you are a domestic terrorist. We're going to read some of their language directly. Make sure that you visit our friends over at batterystation.com. You can get to them on the web at batterystation.com. Make sure that you call them if you don't find what you want on the web. They're the largest purveyor of batteries and electronic gear and flashlights and things like that in the nation, distribute all over the country. You can call them at 417-257-7799. Swing by and visit our friends at Pizza Hut, wherever you may be. But if you happen to be in the West Plains area, make sure that you go to the one on Porter Wagoner Boulevard and tell those folks we appreciate what you've done and support that you've put forth for America's Voice Now. Visit my friends over at Atlas Survival Shelters for the best invariable family-size shelters for any emergency. You can get to their website at atlassurvivalshelters.com. And we'll be building them a brand new site, which should be unveiled fairly shortly. And I'm sure you'll enjoy that. If you have an opportunity, you can go to their Facebook page and like it at facebook.com/Atlas Survival Shelters. We'll be right back.